Good afternoon. So we will start the session. We have a double lecture, the session on Entangled Inequalities, Conceptual Frameworks, and Latin American Contributions. And we'll have sharing the space, sharing the time. We have Elizabeth Jelin, who is a senior researcher of the CONICET, with headquarters at the SIS IDES of Buenos Aires and professor of postgraduate program in social science at the IDES. Her research topics are human rights, the memories of political repression, citizenship, social movements, and the family. In 2013, she received the Jose Award for career in research in social sciences, awarded by the Argentine government. She has been a member of the board of directors of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, a member of the UNESCO, and member of the academic board of the Wissenschaftskollege zu Berlin. She has a PhD from University of Texas, Austin. She has a long story with Brazil. She has been here in the 70s when she has done research on the work of women in Salvador, Bahia. She also wrote a pioneer paper about the first workers' strikes under the Brazilian dictatorship in 1968. Since the 90s, her topics of research, publications, and teaching have been citizenship and human rights, the memories of political repression in the Southern Cone, the transformation of families and social movements. Among her most recent books it include the works of Memory, 2002, Bread and Affections, the Transformation of Families, Photography and Identity, Captured by the Camera, Returned by Memory, and sorry. And that's a lot of books here. I will not mention all of them.
No, please.
So, and her most recent work, I don't know if it's the most recent work, but the work she will talk about today, it's in this book, organized with Sergio, Global Entangled Inequalities, Conceptual Debates, and Evidence from Latin America, organized by Elizabeth Jelin, Sergio, and Renata Mota. And, well, Sergio Costa is full professor of sociology at the Institute of Latin American Studies and the Institute of Sociology of the Freie Universität Berlin and associate researcher at SEBRAP. He's also the speaker of the Maria Sibylla Merian Center, Conviviality in Unequal Societies. From 2009 to 2013, he has also been the coordinator of the project Independent Inequalities in Latin America, Structures and Negotiations, funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. He's the editor of the series Entangled Inequalities, Exploring Global Symmetries, a member of the scientific board of research of the Ibero-American Institute. He has published several articles, chapters, and books on social inequality, cultural difference, post-colonialism, racism, and anti-racism. He recently edited the book Democracy in Contemporary Reconfigurations of Law in Latin America. And in Brazil, I think his most famous book is Dois Atlânticos, Teoria Social, Antirracismo e Cosmopolitismo. At least this was the first thing I read from you. So we are very happy to have these both very significant scholars together to talk together about this book that they recently edited. And it's a real pleasure to have you both together for this task.
Thank you. We will start. So hello again, and thank you very much, Marta Machado, for this kind introduction. It's, of course, for me an honor and a pleasure to share this presentation with Elizabeth Jelin. Elizabeth Jelin has worked a lot on inequality together with us in Berlin not only in Berlin, this was an international network on studies on inequality called Desigualdades.net. And the book Marta mentioned is also a product of the work of this network. What I am going to do is to present actually the introduction of this book, in which we introduce the framework of entangled inequalities. And Elizabeth Jelin will present, in a certain way, also her chapter in this book. In this chapter, she introduced some discussions on the tension between inequality and differences, based or starting from some Latin American contributions. So, as you know, in the first day of this school, you had already a very broad discussion on inequalities, but I don't think that our presentation today and also the roundtable after our presentation will be a kind of redundance with the first day, because our approaches are in a certain way complementary. As you saw on the first day of the school, the approach there were more quantitative and also based more on national units, while we are more concerned on the global character of inequalities and also on somehow more conceptual and also qualitative approach. It doesn't work. So, you see there our outline. So we start reconstructing, not in the sense of reconstruction as Marcus Nobri treated before. It's really, in so to say, literal terms, a reconstruction of some context in which we observe today a revival of inequality research. Then I'd like to emphasize some shifts in the inequality research today. Mostly, I'd like to emphasize three different shifts. And then, of course, these shifts in conceptual terms led also to a methodological pluralization of inequality research. And I'd like to close my part in this presentation with a kind of dilemma you have, since you are emphasizing that inequalities are always global. However, the forms of dealing with inequality, the forms of promoting redistribution, are mostly concentrated on the scope of national states. And this is, of course, a kind of contradiction. You have inequalities globally produced, but instruments for mitigating inequalities which are concentrated at the national level, meaning that you are only able to mitigate inequalities in a very partial degree. So we are not able, in terms of instruments, of political instruments, to mitigate inequalities at the global level. So, and then Elizabeth Jelin will, as I said, introduce these discussions starting from some Latin American debates. So this is a moment of advertisement. This is the series of books mentioned before by Marta Machado. We have already published 4 volumes in this series, 2 monographs and 2 volumes. And as you see there, I don't know if you can read the first book on the bottom, is the first book of the series, organized by my lovely friend and colleague, Lena Lavinas, and another also also lovely colleague and and friend Barbara Fritz. And then we have these two monographs and just published this book from which I'm talking about the introduction. So let's start with the reconstruction of debates on inequality today. Of course, this is not a broad reconstruction of whole debates in social sciences, but you can find in the 90s emphasis on discussions on differences and differentiation, recognition, reflexivity, were at that time the most quoted words and concepts in social sciences, also in Brazil, also in Latin America. And we had a broad reception of authors such as Anton Giddens, Axel Honneth, Habermas, in whose work the interest for inequalities were at that time very limited. Not to say absent, completely absent. At the same time, you had in Latin America and also in East European context a focus on democratization because of the political moment lived by these countries, in these countries, and the emphasis on political rights, while discussions on inequalities and forms of redistribution were at that time not really present. Concerns on poverty were at that time very present, but not on inequality. So just to be sure, so to say, to make here the point and the difference, while inequality refers to a relation, if you talk about inequality, you talk about at least two parts, the rich and the poor, or men and women. So you have at least two parts in a relation. In most cases, you have more than two parts. And if you talk about poverty, we're talking about a kind of state, not really on a relation. And this is important to emphasize here that discussions in the 90s were also in Latin America very concentrated on poverty and not on inequalities. From the 2000s, we have a kind of revival of inequality research, not saying that inequality research was completely absent, but inequality research was not in the 90s in the core, at the core of the interests of social scientists. And this picture changed from, or has changed since the 2000s, and there are some explanations for this. The first one are, of course, frustrations with the so-called neoliberal global capitalism, and also the inequalities produced by global capitalism. We have also a revival of political economy in different schools, the school of regulation, the degrowth school is also important, but also the whole discussion on the reconstruction of the idea of the so-called primitive accumulation in concepts as coined by David Harvey, accumulation by dispossession. You have also at the level of society a search for more complex forms of justice, meaning that we have new forms of constructing claims for gender, not gender equality, but gender justice, ethno-racial justice, also environmental justice and injustice, became at that time a really important part of the agenda. And of course, also the discussion of colonial and post-colonial justice, injustice, meaning that historical process as colonialism and slavery went to the core of the agenda and in a certain way led to a turn in the mainstream research agenda, posing questions on inequality really in the center of discussions. So, of course, this is a kind of schematic form of discussing chains on this agenda, I'd like to emphasize using three questions: inequality of what, inequality between whom, and inequality when and where. Indeed, actually 4 different questions. Using these questions, I'd like to highlight how the research agenda of inequality scholarship changed in that sense, that included new perspectives concerning these 3 plus 1, the 4 questions. First, concerning the question of inequality of what. As we saw on the first day of this school, the discussion there were more concentrated on inequality of income and also inequality of wealth. Marta Recci introduced other aspects in this question, inequality of what, talking about inequalities in terms of health, in terms of access to school, and so on. So you see there is a broadening of this agenda in the answer, inequalities of what. Also, the more liberal form to deal with inequality, insisting on the aspect of inequality of opportunities, meaning that politics should create more equality of opportunities. We have also at this time a kind of turn in this discussion through the emphasis on inequality of positions. So instead to talk about inequality of opportunities, saying we live in a meritocratic society, we have to provide equal opportunities for everyone. So there is a whole discussion of this idea of meritocracy at that time, showing that meritocracy is much more ideology than really, so to say, a condition of life in our contemporary societies. Therefore, you should emphasize the results, inequality of positions and equality of positions. So the claim is no longer for inequality of equality of opportunities, but for more equality of positions, of final positions of individual or groups. We have also used, and you saw this already in the first day of the school, more and more use of tax declarations in order to take into account not only income, but wealth in a broad sense, meaning property, entitlements, and so on. So the idea of wealth is, of course, a more encompassing idea than the idea of income. Important is also the inclusion in discussion of inequalities of power. Of course, there is a correlation between socioeconomic inequalities and asymmetries of power, but there is also a kind of independence in these 2 dimensions. So you can have more power equality without to have at the same time more equality in socioeconomic terms. Without to, hopefully, to enter in a polemic discussion here, just to give you a sense what I'm trying to show here. If you take the situation of women and blacks in Brazil in the last, let's say, 50 years, there is a increasing, let's say, one should be very careful to formulate the sentence. So you have a kind of mitigation in a certain way, or mitigation of inequalities of power. But this doesn't mean automatically that the socioeconomic inequalities between black and whites and men and women also reduce in the same proportion. So as you see, there is a correlation, but there is also a kind of independence in these 2 aspects of inequality. Other dimension of inequality, which is was emphasized by an author named Jordan Ternborn, is a very interesting aspect is in terms of existential inequalities, meaning inequalities in terms of conducting our lives according to our own perspectives. And this capacity, this possibility to conduct our life according to our projects, life projects, is very unequally distributed in contemporary societies. Of course, this has to do also with inequality of power and also with socioeconomic inequality, but not only. You have a kind of, also here, independent aspect in this form of inequality. Another form of inequality, epistemological inequalities, which have been more and more emphasized in debates, and this applies not only for science, so being a social science in Brazil, speaking Portuguese, is from, so to say, from the beginning, a kind of very difficult position to become an internationally recognized scholar. If you are born in an English-speaking country and have another education than you can have in Brazil, your, so to say, starting point to competition is another. So this is an aspect I think it's quite easy to see here some inequalities, but there are another aspect. If you are, I don't know, an indigenous child who was born in a situation in which your knowledge, what you receive in your socialization as knowledge, has not the same value as the knowledge received by a child who went to school, I don't know, in the best school of Berlin. So you see, you have here also a kind of epistemological, in terms of valorization of different knowledge, you have also epistemological inequalities. And you have also ecological inequalities. You can also say ecological inequalities are a product of power inequalities and also socioeconomic inequalities, but ecological inequalities has a particularity. Since normally, if you talk about inequalities, we are talking about inequalities in terms of possession of or access to service, to goods. While if you talk about environmental inequalities, you are talking, so to say, negatively. This has to do with environmental risks. We're talking about protection against risks and not possession of goods and access to service. So you have important conceptual differences if you talk about ecological inequalities. So let's go to the second question, inequality between whom. I think this is, I can just mention this briefly because it's quite clear for social scientists today that inequality has to do not only with individuals but also with groups. So to be part of a group or to be adscribed as a part of a certain group, blacks, indigenous, whites, and so on, that has consequences for inequalities. That means independently on your own effort, on your own merit, of course, if you are considered by your peers, a part of a group, you have different let's say, life possibilities. And therefore, it becomes more and more important to take into account also this kind of, as some scholars say, horizontal inequalities, not vertical inequalities between individuals, but also inequalities between groups, meaning women and men, blacks and whites, majorities and minorities, also age groups, as you know, are important references for studying inequalities. Now the third and fourth questions in just one slide, inequalities where and when. Conventional research on inequality is focused on national units. So you study inequality between regions within a country or individuals within a country, but not inequalities between world regions. And this is a tendency, a trend in inequality research today. I should confess that the methods to study global inequalities are not really developed, but the attention for global inequalities is more and more important also in more or less mainstream academias. Important here is also to highlight, and please don't ask me how this author Cracker came to this conclusion, but his conclusion is that national inequalities represent only 1/3 of the existing inequalities. 2/3 of the existing inequalities have to do with global entanglements, with global relations and correlations. That means that there is a kind of joke I make with my students, but I think to clarify this point, if you meet a person without to see his or her face, if it's a woman or a man, if it's a black or white, if it's, so to say, with very expensive clothes or not, and you have one question to pose to identify the position of this person in the global social structure. What should be the question that give you better chances to, so to say, to find out the position of this person in the global social structure? Is, of course, her or his nationality or citizenship. Asking this question, you have at least 2/3 of possibilities to, so to say, classify this person adequately in the global social structure. If you ask about, don't know, skin color or gender, you can control only a small part of the whole thing. So we have also some new perspectives in studying global inequalities. We mentioned here 2 transnational perspectives and also world system perspectives, in which national units are no longer the unit of observation of the analytical unit, but they are dealing with other forms of units. So inequality when? It's just to mention that inequality have, of course, also a historical dimension, or a historical composition, constitution of inequalities. If you take the inequalities between blacks and whites in Latin America today, of course, this is not an inequality made today in current times. It's reproduced today and also produced today, but it's an inequality which has been constructed through history since slavery. This is more or less clear, but it's quite difficult to find concepts to deal with kind of historical constitution of inequalities, and more difficult is to measure this kind of inequalities. Our colleague who also writes a chapter in this book, Jairo Baquero, coined for his study, he didn't create the concept, but he worked on this concept of layered inequalities in order to study inequalities concerning Afro-Colombians, showing that there is a kind of superposition of inequalities in different layers, therefore layered inequality in the history of Colombia, which explains the existence of some inequalities concerning white indigenous, mestizos, and black Colombians. So, following this broadening, this expansion, this kind of opening of the inequality research, we have also some methodological novelties, and perhaps more present or more evident is the use of tax declarations, as already mentioned, in order to measure not only income, but also income and wealth. And also, as showed in the first day of the school, using tax declarations, you are in a better condition, in a better position to understand the concentration of income and wealth in the very, very high top of the social structure. So to really to take into account the concentration of wealth and income in the 1% reached in each state in a society, you have to take a tax declaration, since household service don't get this specificity. But you have also a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods or methodologies in inequality research. We have also in the book, this is not to make publicity about the book, this is just to give examples how to do with this kind of methodological pluralization. A colleague who worked with the concept of care chains to understand the inequalities, the chains of inequalities existing in the case of Peruvians who go to Italy to work there in the care work. So, meaning that if a woman leaves but in her case, there are also many men, not only women, left a woman who leaves her village in Peru. If she is a mother, her child will be cared mostly by the grandmother or grandparents, and she goes to Italy to, I don't know, also to care children of other families there. So in this, so to say, chains, you construct new forms of inequality. And this is a kind also, or just to exemplify a novelty in the methodologies of studying inequalities. Also important is emphasis on the construction of social categorization. So understanding that we cannot just take categories such as census categories, blacks and whites and browns and so on. No, you have also to study how these categories are, so to say, experienced, are lived in real life, because this has also consequences in terms of discrimination and also in terms of inequalities. So here's a kind of table in which I summarize what I have demonstrated until now, and please look just at the last column in this table. This is our approach we have tried to develop, is the entangled inequalities approach, and at least our attempt, how far we really are able to work with this relational, not spatial unit of analysis, how far we are really working with diachronic and synchronic perspectives and so on. So please read the book, and you can answer at the end if we really, so to say, fulfill what we promised. But we are promising is to, at least at the conceptual level, to take these dimensions into account, meaning not to work with spatial units of analysis or observation as, for instance, national states or national borders, but to follow the relations connected to our subject. If you are studying migrant, and this migrant transpasses national borders, you have, of course, to find a unit of analysis able to follow your migrant. Otherwise, you cannot understand the social inequalities related to this migrant. And also the idea of taking into account history and also present inequalities, to take into account different dimensions and so on. So this led us to a definition of inequalities, of entangled inequalities. I will read this because each word matters in this definition. Entangled inequalities refer to distances between positions occupied by individuals or groups of individuals defined according to racial, gender, or other categorizations within the social structure. Please look at this construction. We are not saying national social structure, we are saying just social structure. This concerns economic positions defined by income, access to resources, etc., and political and legal entitlements, rights, political power, etc., as well as exposure to environmental risks. In order to understand the linkage from which unequal positions arise, it's necessary to have relational units of analysis that are dynamically defined in the process of inquiry itself. So, this is, of course, a very encompassing definition, but it's a kind of abstract of the whole project. Let's conclude with a dilemma, as mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. The dilemma is the fact that we have global entangled processes are major drivers of existing inequalities, while national states, following national political logics, remain the key actor in promoting redistribution. The importance of national states you can see very much in this table. It's a table which is quite is very known, and of course we are concentrated here on income and national states. But if you take the existing inequalities before taxes and transfers and after taxes and transfers, you see that European countries are able to reduce inequalities. If you like, this light blue marks are inequalities produced by capitalism, by Marx. And the column, the dark blue or red column, are the final inequalities in terms of income inequalities. You see that the distance between the inequalities produced by the market and the final inequality, in case of Latin American countries, is almost inexistent. That means that the states are not able to mitigate inequalities in case of Latin American countries, while in case of European countries, the inequality produced by market is virtually the same as in Latin America, but states are able, in certain cases, to reduce this inequality to the half of the first position. So here, this graph is very emphatic to emphasize, to demonstrate the importance of states for reducing inequalities, at least at the national level. So, in the dilemma to which you perhaps can come back in the discussion is the fact that you have globally constructed inequalities, and the main actor in mitigating inequality is the national state, which is only able to reduce inequalities at the national level. So you see, you have here a kind of political, modern dilemma, a political, really drama, because you don't have a solution for this drama. But so I hand out to Elizabeth Jelin.
Well, first,
I want to thank the invitation to be here and to share some ideas and to learn from others a lot, which I've done up to now. And my talk will be different from Sergio's in the sense that I will pick up on some issues which are there, which has to do with the dilemmas between inequality and difference. But before doing that, I want to say a few words about the world we live in today. During the last decades, the hegemonic neoliberal and individualistic economic paradigm, casting aside social structures and the central role of institutions, has placed emphasis on individual capabilities, efforts, and personal achievement as the motors of well-being, alluding only tangentially to socially structured inequalities. This dominant ideology did not consider social structures and power relations, be they global or local. Thus, it involved more talk about poverty than about inequalities, and social policies, where they were implemented, were geared towards reducing poverty rather than towards redistributing wealth. Additionally, the language of class and social struggles and the role of the state as a regulator, beyond the implementation of compensatory policies, were blurred, if not lost altogether. This neoliberal dominance coincided with an increase in social demands for the recognition of diversity. And these demands generated changes in interpretive frameworks and policies of recognition, focused on the celebration of diversity, multiculturalism, and difference. Undoubtedly, it is more than a matter of coincidence. The affinities between neoliberal individualism and the exaltation of diversity, understood as difference rather than as inequality, are noteworthy. Analytical approaches follow these shifts, paying more attention to cultural diversity and claims for recognition than to structural inequalities and claims for resources. Thus, the need to tackle the links between structural inequalities and social differences, differences anchored in various ascribed categories, particularly gender, ethnicity, race, and citizenship. In the words of Brubaker, he says that these differences are not intrinsically linked to inequality. Different does not necessarily mean unequal. The relation between difference and inequality is contingent, not necessary. It is empirical and not conceptual. And the degree to which and the manner in which inequality is structured along categorical lines vary widely over time and context. End of quote. So the links between inequalities and differences, or inequality and diversity, are not simple. Social categories, we know, are constructed historically and culturally, and their salience changes or varies along time and place. Once in place, however, they do matter in the production and reproduction of inequalities. So we are faced here with an idea of multiple inequalities, multiple dimensions of stratification and social categorization, which is nowadays almost part of the common sense in social sciences. Yet, this multiplicity does not mean, and this is what I want to show, does not mean that all dimensions are interchangeable or can be treated in an analogous way. At a structural level, the concern for inequalities brings social classes to the center of attention. Be it in the analysis of the structure of productive activities and labor markets, or in the analysis of their outcomes in the forms of income distribution, for instance, this has been the core of social thinking in relation to the dynamics of inequalities and the mechanisms of its production and reproduction mechanisms such as exploitation or hoarding of opportunities. The issue is to uncover how class structure is linked to social categorizations and differentiations based on diverse, mostly ascribed cultural and social dimensions such as ethnicity, race, gender, age, nationality, religion, language, and so on. Categories and categorizations operate from the outside. Others, groups, institutions define borders, boundaries, rights, and entitlements accruing from belonging and evaluation and discrimination of the excluded. They also operate from within, from the inside, through subjective feelings, self-identification, and enactment of cultural practices. In the midst of political struggles, moreover, actors can develop social categorizations as strategic identifications that help them in defining themselves and their opponents. Thus, the links between these structural positions and relations in social systems on the one hand, and ascribed and culturally bound categorizations on the others, again, I repeat, are contingent, they change over time, and are different for the different dimensions that we are going to deal with. While ethnicity may imply, for instance, relatively close communities, segregated and often discriminated against by others, gender cuts across social classes and culturally defined communities. There is no isolated community based on gender. In contemporary social analysis, this multidimensional aspect of social categorization and inequalities is being approached through the notion of intersectionality. I imagine many of you have heard this word. Stemming from feminist perspectives concerned with locating gender inequalities in a broader frame, this notion, intersectionality, alludes to the fact that gender, ethnicity, and class operate simultaneously in generating and displaying inequalities. The corollary of this statement is a methodological warning. Any analysis of inequalities will be incomplete if it does not take into account these multiple dimensions of the phenomenon. As a methodological warning, it cannot be contested. However, at an analytical and theoretical level, it does not tell us much about the nature of the links between gender inequalities and these other dimensions. In what follows, I take as a point of departure the centrality of structural class-related inequalities and look at their links to these diverse social categorizations and socially constructed differences, considering that each of these categorizations has a dynamic of its own. A question, is intersectionality a new perspective? And what I want to show is that it is not. It's not necessarily that, because the relationship or the link between class and other categorizations, gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, has been present, at least in Latin American thought, for a long time. So I decided, when realizing this, to search for some of these roots and to look into the history of Latin American thinking to see how various authors have dealt with this matter. Here I will present a few, just some hints of some of these authors, choosing a special period of Latin American social thought, which is after post-Second World War, when in the region there was much concern about what type of capitalist development was taking place. So at that time, the consideration of inequalities was anchored in the issue of capitalist development, issues such as marginality, rural-urban differences, the peasantry, salaried work and other forms of work, national bourgeoisies and oligarchies, the formation or absence of middle classes were the types of themes that were analyzed. The formation of a class society with heavy emphasis on the passage towards merit and stratification anchored more in acquired characteristics than ascribed ones was in the horizon. So social class was the center, and the others were which ones deserved attention? Ethnic and racial composition of the population and the insertion of non-white groups into the lowest position of the social structure, and immigrants' European origin into the working class was one of the concerns. The subordinate position of women in the patriarchal structure, however, was a more novel topic with little or no tradition in Latin American social thinking, even when women thinkers and activists had been problematizing this throughout the 20th century. Spatial differences, rural, urban, regional differences, were also significant, always seen in a dynamic manner of part of the process of urbanization. I think I'll get my water. There was also a concern with international level that were interpreted in terms of the relations between center and periphery. Capitalist development in Latin America, and we have to remember here the whole ECLAC school of thought, was peripheral. And the basic goal to understand its challenges were present at ECLAC, Raúl Prebisch, and so on. They then came to be interpreted in terms of dependence. And then the understanding of inequalities in a world system perspective was still far into the future. This line is what we continue in this book. So let me just go into a few, the next, how do I go to the next? No, this. Here you have the titles of several books, and I'll go over very fast in this part. Several books written in the 60s and 70s by authors who were precursors of this idea of intersectionality. First, Florestan Fernandes. Brazilians know a lot about Florestan Fernandes, and I'll not say much. Within the framework of class formation in capitalist development, Fernandes tackles the analysis of the social position of the Negro. I use the word he used at that time, Negro, in Brazil. The general question is posed in terms of the development of a competitive social order as an ineluctable development. The author asks himself about the predisposition and abilities that different human groups have to enter into relations of production required by this competitive social order. That is, there is no question that Brazil was going into a capitalist development. That's not the question. That's not the issue. What are the expectations on the part of the system in expansion? Who are the potential workers prepared to insert themselves into the system? In this regard, the Negro is handicapped vis-à-vis the European worker. This is all what Fernandes was analyzing, due to the history of slavery. Fernandes sees the origin of the situation of the Negro in the mid-20th century in the history of slavery and in the challenges faced by ex-slaves after the abolition. The structural conditions are complemented by psychological factors, something that decades later would enter into what is currently conceptualized as subjectivity and capacity of action or agency of subaltern subjects. Social action is not driven only by obscure forces beyond human action. Rather, Fernandes casts his eye on the limited options open to Negroes and how their way of acting, learned in the slave past, that which, I'll mention it a bit later, Bauman calls class memory, influence the process of integration into class society. What he does is basically to discard essences and to historicize processes. There is nothing essential in race. There are historical processes that could have been different. Urban capitalist development, salaried work, and the competitive social order are the structuring axis of social reality. Some trajectories and experiences adapt more easily to them, such as those of the immigrant European workers, while others hinder the process of integration. He speaks something about Black women, saying that they are used to day-to-day domestic labor, they experience more continuity and fewer ruptures in their way of life. Thus, their possibilities of benefiting from their experience doubly subordinated to their employers and to their partners in the family. Given the maladjustments in the process of creation of this competitive social order, with strong lines of racial inequalities and the absence of racial democracy, despite the myth of Brazilian racial democracy, where can one seek the seeds of transformation of social practices and racial hierarchies? Fernandez dedicates a full volume to the analysis of collective social movements on the one hand, and to the egalitarian impulses on the other. The question is posed in a relational manner. One needs to study how racial tensions are perceived and socially controlled by various actors in order to understand processes of change. I go now to Rodolfo Staffenhagen. I'm sorry, it's the last name. Rodolfo Staffenhagen is a Mexican anthropologist, and in 1969 he published a book called Las clases sociales en las sociedades agrarias. He analyzes the southern part of Mexico, the Mexican region, and Guatemala, and he takes as his point of departure the passage from the stage of military conquest to the implementation of the colonial system, a product of mercantilist expansion, and looks at what goes on in the indigenous communities that became a labor reserve for the colonial economy. He goes then into analyzing the history of this whole process and sees that both the colonial system and class relations underlay interethnic relations, although in different ways. In colonial terms, indigenous society as a whole confronted the colonial power. Relations were defined in terms of ethnic discrimination, segregation, social inferiority, and economic subjection. Class relations, on the other hand, were defined in terms of labor relations and property. Thus, it was not a matter of labor relations between two societies, but rather between specific sectors of the same society. Colonial relations responded to mercantilism, class relations to capitalism. In Mexico, in the 1960s, Staffenhagen argues, the rapid development of class relations to the detriment of colonial relations produces the development of indigenismo as an ideology and as a principle of action. This is a nationalist position, one that asks for strengthening indigenous government and demanding national political representation of the indigenous peoples. And Staffenhagen analyzed that and all his life. He died a couple of years ago. He was devoted to try to understand and to promote, because he was very active in the international scene on indigenous rights. Again, we are faced here with the paradox between equality and difference, posed decades later by Nancy Fraser and Joan Scott. According to this logic, for Staffenhagen, I quote, national integration can only be attained if the contradictions inherent in colonial relations are resolved and overcome. This can be achieved either by suppressing one of the terms of the contradiction or by changing the content of the relationship. For Staffenhagen, the way out of this disjuncture is to achieve national integration not by suppressing the Indio, but by suppressing him as a colonized being. I'll go much faster with the gender issues, because differently from race and ethnicity, where gender is transversal, is present everywhere. So how did the issue of gender come up during that time in the literature, in the thinking of these Latin American thinkers? First, Lieci Safiotti, in 1969, wrote this book, A Mulher na Sociedade de Classes, Mito e Realidade, within the framework of Florestan Fernandez's. She was a student of Florestan Fernandez, within the framework of Florestan Fernandez's approach in terms of class formation. And what she was asking is specifically what happens to, in that case, women or a mulher. So she goes into, again, the tradition of the slave economy and changes in processes of urbanization and the abolition of slavery that jointly with European immigration produced significant changes in the organization of the family, in particular, the destabilization of the patriarchal family. Urbanization produces transformation in the social position of urban women, the expansion of cultural horizons, the limitation of childbearing, divorce. Additionally, there was a growing adoption of a Western legal family framework, which paradoxically implies the reinforcement of sexual taboos that perhaps was not so present in slave society. Cultural factors are at play, the cult of feminine virginity in a world of double standards, and the exaltation of the macho as the ideal of masculinity. Yet, what Safiotti did not approach, but was taken up by Isabelle Larguilla and Jean Dumoulin, is the domestic sphere and what happens inside the family. They depart from they were working in Cuba right after the revolution, and their work had to do with a Marxist perspective on gender in looking again at capitalist development and class. In Marxist theory, the focus is on modes of production, implying looking at the relations between the production of commodities and the means of subsistence. The other side of the equation, the production of human beings who go on to participate in processes of production, was much less developed theoretically. Much was said about the means of production, almost nothing about the means of reproduction. And this is where Larguilla's and Dumoulin's contribution was highly significant, because they put the fingers on the reproductive activities that are carried out in households and that contribute to social reproduction in three ways, because it has to do with the biological reproduction, it has to do with the daily reproduction of the possibility of a laborer or a worker going tomorrow to work after having a meal, after having slept in a clean bed, and so on, and who is in charge of doing all that tasks. And the third notion of social reproduction, which are the tasks linked to the maintenance of the social system, those linked to care and early socialization of children. All these tasks are in the hands of women, and they are what at that time we were talking about invisible domestic work. Over the decades, this was shifted a bit in terms of separating or distinguishing in more subtle ways the labor of care, of caring of people, and the labor and domestic work on the other side. Perhaps I'm not, this link to the current interest in care. And the link to care is something which is very important because it has gone into policy decisions. In Latin America, Uruguay and Costa Rica have national care policies. And secretarias, all the administrative bodies, link it with the idea that providing care for the population is not necessarily something which should be hidden and should be in the hands of women in families and in households, but rather it's part of social protection of, in the hands of governments. I'll just give a very nice talk. Earlier, in the 50s, this research on Cuba, and wrote a book, Racismo y Sexualidad en la Cuba Colonial, which again brings together issues of the formation of class society, of gender, and in this case also very much into the issue of the body and sexuality. So this is just to give a few hints of ways in which Latin American thinkers tackled earlier than today issues related to the multiple inequalities and the links between them. All of these authors which I mentioned put the centrality on capitalist development and on class formation. Class has been a concept that has not been around for several decades, those intermediate decades in which other issues of modernization took a lead. And they are, now, I think, now it's time to come back to issues related to class. So what can we learn from this overview in light of some of the debates and dilemmas that we have today? I would like to make 3 comments and finish with them, 3 or 4, I don't remember. First, a comment about time, process, and change. The complex process of change tied to capitalist development in the region imply different rhythms of transformation in different dimensions. Asynchronies and mismatches are not random. The motor of change was and still is the development of new forms of economic organization, then looked at in each country or nation, nowadays recognizing and considering in a much more visible way the importance of the global level and the interdependencies and entanglements involved. At the level of the actors and their scenarios, what happens with populations that are in the process of changing their forms of life and labor? Who is prepared for the change? Fernandez shows that the strong legacies of slave labor among Black populations in Brazil and the mismatch between their modes of life and values and the demands of the new system was a hindrance to their incorporation. Staffenhagen demonstrates the continuities and new challenges that development poses for agrarian indigenous communities. Safiotti inquired into the changes in the situation of women. In all cases, learned and lived forms do not match the demands of capitalist development. These disjunctions are central in the experiences of class formations. Sigmund Bauman, in an old book, not one of them, does an analysis of a concept he calls class memory. He refers to historical memory or remembered history as, I quote, the propensity of a group towards certain responsive behaviors rather than others. This remembered history explains the reactions of a group to the change in the circumstances of life. The results may be diverse. Disorganization reflected in prophecies of imminent catastrophe, the proliferation of revolutionary utopias, political, social, and cultural realignments. Insofar as the process of articulation of class society is slow at any historical moment, Bauman says, it is the memorized class strategies that provide the cognitive and normative patterns to deal with what is experienced. Yet something has to be added to Bauman's analysis. The other social categorization, ethnic, racial, national, gender, are interwoven at the level of the experience of class, and thus enter in an inextricable way in the formation of memories that will guide the practices of actors. Second, and that the issues involved here can be set in the perspective of the analysis that look at the tensions between demands for equality and redistribution and demands for recognitions of specificities, differences, and identities. As an analytical model, this paradigm was developed later by Nancy Fraser. In the 1970s, it was felt more in action of historical subjects than in a paradigm or a model. It is clear, however, that the analysis centered on capitalist development and class societies cannot be completed without considering gender and ethnicity in an explicit way. Then and now, the feeling of living in a world of inequalities and injustices and the intent to contribute to struggles for the transformation of the historical situation of discriminated groups act as a strong motivation for research and for political action. Third, and to come back once more to the link between inequalities and differences, one can connect the type of analysis with the current discussions on intersectionality. Can relations between the various dimensions involved be established that go beyond the exhortation not to forget something? The authors reviewed here share a theoretical perspective in which capitalist development and therefore class inequalities are the key to change at the macro-social level. Starting from that premise, they consider and analyze in concrete historical situations how gender and ethnicity and race play out. Contemporary proposals are much more open, yet an important step in tackling the complex articulation is to follow the path marked by the analytical distinction between class inequalities and the diverse cultural differences, looking at the specific ways in which they are entangled in specific historical situations. The interaction of these different dimensions crystallizes in structures of inequalities. Therefore, the struggle for greater equality requires actions at their interdependencies and linkages. No gradual strategy of one at a time, which is a message that comes from Albert Hirschman, can act to redress a crystallized complex structure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sergio and Elizabeth, for this very important discussion. It was not intended, but in fact, I'm very happy that we are closing this call with coming back to the discussion on inequality, in broadening the way we deal with it. We start, I'll take advantage of the microphone, and I'll start thinking of two issues that came to my mind while we were talking, Sergio, that I think it's really very interesting, the epistemologic shift that you bring to the discussion when we think about global and entangled inequalities. And two issues that I was thinking is how to do it, if it is a challenge to this view, to bring this discussion without weakening the state capacity to address policies on inequality, if it's a question that comes up. And the second thing was the importance of social movements in doing this work of bringing international experiences and the international approach, and also comparative approach to influence national politics. So do you think in this context they have a privileged or a very important role? And so just this first one, then we can collect more questions.
Hi, my name is Ivan Fernandes. I'm from the Federal University of ABC. I'm very pleased with all the presentations. There are a lot of new ideas and new thoughts to the study of inequality. But I want to make a question for Sergio, that how can we study inequality, globally speaking, without data? Because there is a fine irony in your presentation that you talk about how there is much more dimensions to study inequality, the relational problem, the different units of analysis, but in the end of the day, the data that you show us was the usual business, Gini by country. And sometimes, how can we tackle this problem of inequality in a global manner if we don't have data to do that?
Hi, my name is Daniela. I'm from Unicamp. I have a question to Sergio too. When you talked about epistemological inequalities, the first thought that we have is that we have to reduce those inequalities. But the idea is to reduce the difference of how the world sees the value of these different epistemologies, or to guarantee that everyone has access to the same one, because the latter seems a lot like a way to justify and in a way to epistemicide.
Thank you both for the presentations. I'm sorry I arrived a bit late, so maybe I'll ask you something that you already said, Sergio, but I think, well, I'd like to put it anyway. So you both did a presentation. I'm going to follow up in this data thing, actually, but I actually have 2 points. One is about the definition of entangled inequality itself, because you are both talking about that, and Sergio defined it as in terms of individuals or groups of individuals. So you are not defining it in terms of individuals and positions. So you are not talking about relations. And in the beginning, you said you are proposing a different perspective, but it seems to me that you are working on an attributional way of talking about inequality. And that comes my second question. In the field of sociology, and you are a sociologist yourself, so we have a very consolidated discussion about inequality in theoretical terms, and there are 2 inevitable authors, I would say, Goldthorpe and Olin Wright, that you didn't mention. And they are both working in terms of inequality using new definitions of class and this kind of discussion, but they are relying on data. And when you finally presented some data, I was trying to read there in the footnote, and it was a very heterogeneous data. So I'd like to hear a little bit about how it was actually produced, which data is that one. But the whole point is, besides what to do, what is good in this debate of inequality without data, and in case we're not going to produce data, how reliable is your data or the other data you are using, and why using those and so many others that are available, or to rely on those established scholars like Goldthorpe and Olin Wright. And the last question is more an empirical one, actually, because you mentioned many different types of inequalities, and I was wondering here, I don't know if you mentioned before my arrival, about intergenerational inequalities, but not just in terms of the way it is usually placed in terms of environmental damage. I think my time is over. I talked too much. Because the new generations are dealing very well with the new technologies better than the others, but they have less access to jobs. If you look to Europe, employment taxes, you are going to see that the job market is not very good for the youngest. So I'd like to hear you talk about that a little bit. Thanks.
Would you like to start?
I'll take up a couple of things. A few, and then you. The first is a reflection on data. What I heard in the they say there is no data, is quantitative data. We work not only with quantitative data. How do we see relational issues is also through qualitative research. It's through, Sergio mentioned the work of Ana Scornia, which is one of the authors in the book, dealing with care chains and Peruvians, and it's Peru and Italy in the sense that Peruvian workers go to Italy with a certain legal pattern of established to work, to take care of all the elderly in Italy. And what does this flow mean in terms of inequalities is something which is not captured in numbers. It is not in a Gini, and it is not in an income distribution, and it is not in wealth. It is in systems of social relations. And I think that this qualitative data in which you see flows is something that we should really consider data. So the same way as when I discussed Florestan Fernandez or Staffenhagen or Larguia, they did lots of research and there is lots of data, but it is not in the form of an international agency report. So this is one thing, one issue that I think we should take very much into account. Positions do not talk about relations. Data based on positions, that so and so many people have primary education, so and so many people have secondary education, do not say anything about all the systems, the power and economic relations that led to that outcome. So one thing is data on outcomes, another thing is data on process. And data on process is, we do not have we do have some statistical tools, but not many of those. So that's one reflection I have on numbers. The other has to do with intergenerational, the notion of intergenerational inequality. Much of the research, and Goldthorpe is one of the authors, has to do with social mobility. Whether children follow or do not follow, are higher up or lower up in the stratification system than their parents, which is a whole. There is a big methodology in sociology, a big methodological mess, because previously it was usually taken as the father, head of the household, to be the standard. Now that we have much more mixed up households and women have such a very different role in the marketplace, there is no simple solution yet as to how to consider intergenerational mobility. What we do know qualitatively and quantitatively is that the family is the institution that reproduces inequalities. Privileged families convey privilege, underprivileged families convey underprivilege. there is evidence that, for instance, to say two features that I consider underprivileged and just, which is adolescent pregnancy. Adolescent girls who get pregnant in adolescence tend to be daughters of mothers who were also adolescent mothers. And we know that this is a handicap for life for those young in terms of their opportunities and life chances. The same happens with domestic violence. How places, houses, and households where there is domestic violence tend to inherit the domestic violence of the households where their parents were raised. So, and so there is evidence, and there is that these intergenerational inequalities are conveyed, and unless there are interventions, and especially of the state, to if you want, break the rule of family intergenerational transmission, things will not change. So I have something to say about social movements, but no, social movements are local, social movements are national, and social movements are global and international and so on. So I think that if we go with the idea, and this is not new, the labor movement, we all saw movies of the early 20th century, late 19th century, where the Italian anarchists and others were coming to Latin America to create, and the people, the labor activists trying to bring ideas. Ideas do not have national boundaries, and movements do not have national boundaries. So there is much, yet there is something about the local scene. That is, people act in the spaces and in the environments in which they live, in which they work, so that the issue of the communication and the movement is always there. At times there are global campaigns and global movements, and this is not necessarily very, very new. I happen to be a friend of a person, an activist, who was the one who was the head of the boycott of Nestle, when Nestle in the 60s made this milk, the powder milk for babies, and had an incredible world campaign saying that breastfeeding is bad and baby formula is good for the baby. And so there was a big international global campaign against Nestle. And this was a landmark, if you want. It was very, very important at the time, and it was global, and there was no internet, there was no easy communications as today, and I had not seen a significant similar campaign going on now. So the issue of social movements and internationality and global international links is pivotal, is the thing for change.
Okay. Thank you for these are really very good questions and not easy questions.
Not easy questions.
Starting with Marta's points, just to mention some aspects not yet mentioned by Elizabeth Jelin. The political issue, if the fact that you are emphasizing the global character of inequalities could lead to a kind of, so to say, disclaimer for states saying, so look, inequality are produced globally, therefore, at the national level, we as states have not much to do in terms of mitigating inequality. I think if you compare, this was the last table, income inequalities in Latin America and European countries, you see there the role of states. So for mitigating inequalities at the national level, you have, the states are really the key actors. And to the point that you can cut about 50% of existing inequalities in Europe and cut nothing in Latin America. So you see, you have different kinds of states. So the whole discussion on varieties of capitalism, I think they are wrong. They should be called varieties of states. So states make the difference, not capitalism. Capitalism produces inequalities everywhere. The difference is made by states, but just a kind of militant statement. So I don't think that there is a risk to take out the responsibility of states for mitigating inequality. I think with this concept of entangled inequalities, our attention for is to say, look, states alone are not enough. You have also to create institutions to deal with inequalities at the global level. But of course, the institutions you have, they are mostly also institutions controlled by national states. So it's a kind of, so to say, círculo vicioso, vicious circles. So because you are emphasizing everywhere, always the role of national states, even if you need global institutions. About social movements, I agree very much with the points already mentioned by Elizabeth Jelin. Just mention one aspect more. If you take the discussion brought, for instance, by Occupy movement, 1% against the 99%. This is not a category first constructed by social scientists, but it's quite relevant to understand inequalities in the world today. The concentration of wealth in the 1% rich in the world is a fact. And this kind of agenda is brought also by these movements. The whole issue of environmental risks is also, are issues also brought by social movements. Here in this book, the work of Renata Mota comparing movements against GM, genetically modified crops in Argentina and Brazil, is also a discussion very much brought by social movements. So they are central in these discussions, and they are central also in turning the discussion from the national to the global level. If some authors formulate it like this, we had at the end of the 19th century, at least in Europe, the construction of the idea of a social question at the national level, meaning you need social solidarity at the national level in order to mitigate inequalities at the national level. Now what we need is a kind of awareness of the global character of the social question. So the way we live here in São Paulo is, of course, has consequences to inequalities everywhere, but this is not already present in the, so to say, social imagination for this, for making this point clear. Of course, social movements play a crucial, a central role. The question, Ivan Fernandez, isn't it? Yeah. I agree very much that the data we have for studying global inequalities have not the same precision or character that you have in case of national data. So the first question is an epistemological one. Should this lead to the position, so if you don't have data, you should better not talk about global inequalities because you don't have data for studying this. Of course, I'm not saying that you are defending this position, but this could be a position. It is also a position in the debate. Of course, discussions, concepts promote also the construction of data. If you don't have concepts to understand the global dynamic, the global character of inequality, you don't search for data which represent this new conceptualization of inequalities. So this concept, just to say that this, even if we stop at the conceptual level, saying global inequalities are important, should be taken into account, is already, I think, a contribution. So you are also claiming for data, so to say. But we have already some work on global inequalities using existing data. Just to provide one example, there are more than two examples. The first one, again, in this book, Patricio Kozeniewicz, who studies inequalities from a world system perspective. What he does, two things. The first one is to understand inequalities concerning migrants. For instance, if you take migrants who moved from Mexico to US, actually, if you compare the position of these migrants at the national level, they are in a better situation in Mexico than in US, in the West social structure. They, I don't know, they belong to the 50% richest in Mexico, and if they move to US, they, so to say, downsize. They get a worse position in the national social structure in US context. But if you take the global social structure, you see that the position of this guy, of this family, of these migrants, become better than in the situation in Mexico. That means that if you concentrate only on the national social structure, you don't understand this kind of moves, of shifts in social position of migrants, just to take the example of migrants. But he does another thing, which is also interesting, is to using available data, income distribution Gini. He wants to emphasize the importance of historical persistence of inequalities. So he takes groups of countries showing that you have at least 3 patterns of countries. Countries which are very unequal, countries not that unequal, and countries which are more equal. And what he shows is that the countries in these different groups, they have not changed their position in 300 years. So you have a persistence of inequalities in colonies and post-colonies. And countries which are less unequal, which are the European countries and other countries. So you can also, using the available data, also show some global tendencies. And I think this is also a useful exercise. Last example, I cannot remember, somehow, is author from, who is the next World Cup? Qatar, yeah. Author from the University of Qatar is the first author I read from the University of Qatar, who compare countries which are exporters of commodities. And he shows very well how these countries are, per definition, unequal. So you can, using groups of countries and position of these countries in the world trade, showing what kind of product we export and what kind of pattern of inequality you have in these countries. It's also a way to deal with global inequalities using national data. Just to give you some examples how to so to say, to bypass the inexistence of data.
I'll add one more, which comes from Göran Thurburn, and he uses life chances, life inequalities. If you take infant mortality, what are the chances of a child born in Sweden today, and what are the chances of survival of a child born, let's say, in Somalia? You will see that there is a global pattern of inequalities in what? Vital inequalities, he calls it. And I think we do have enough data, international data and global data, to confirm some of those vital inequalities, which then there are also inside each country, but there is a pattern that is global.
So we'll go faster with the questions. I take very much time for the answers, because these are really very crucial questions. Daniela, of course, you can only work at the political level, and can give you also two examples how to do with epistemological inequalities. If you take the academic level, so you can also talk about epistemological inequalities at the academic level. Just to give you one example, how to manage, how to try to mitigate this, the editor of the journal of the International Sociological Association, Current Sociology, or the former editor, Eloisa Martin, who is professor at the University of Rio de Janeiro, tried to make an experiment there, and the experiment was, I accept articles in all languages. And just accepting article in other language than English, she could changed, I don't have the data, but you can check the data. She wrote also on this experience, changed completely the origin of authors published by Current Sociology, just accepting articles in other languages. So if you write in English and it's on mother language, you say, look, I have more merit because my articles get published in Current Sociology and in other important journals. But sometimes just a small change in the submission process is, so to say, a great contribution to mitigate this kind of epistemological inequalities at this level, at the academic level. At the more broader level, of course, it's more difficult. But I give you also an example mentioned by Shalini Randeria. There is a kind of negotiation or dispute between pharmaceutical industry in the US and farmers, small farmers from India, about the use of a technology which these farmers affirm this is a technology they, so to say, they have this technology, and this technology was appropriated by this big industry. So they went to the court, and the farmers in Argentina were accompanied by an NGO, a small NGO, which,
India.
In India, yes.
You said Argentina.
Argentina, I'm sorry. Yeah, India, yeah, in India. This small NGO was, so to say, the juridical support they had. And the industry from US come with lawyers from the Ministry of Agriculture in US. So you see, this kind of differences are reproduced at the institutional level. So using this example, she coined the concept cunning state, Estado astuto, to say Indian state is not a weak state, it's a state which works for the, so to say, for the rich, quite different if you have small farmers and so on in, so to say, affected by such injustice. So, last point, Angela, you just address, all three questions are very interesting, important. Just address the first question on relation. If you are talking about positions, we are talking much more about distances in positions. If we are talking about distance, this is the relation. The distance is the relation between groups of or individuals. And this characterizes the relation. This is the first level. The second level is the fact that these groups are not given. They are constructed, reconstructed permanently. So, therefore, you have always, and this is my difficulty with Charles Tilly, with his, I know, with the, then just to give you the sense of what I'm saying, with the idea of categorical inequalities, because you have kind of fixed groups, and I think these groups are constructed permanently. This is also, so to say, this is also, these constructions is also a form of social relation. So you have relations at these both levels. But I know this is a huge question, and yeah.
What would you say about Bourdieu's theory of stratification, though, because it's not so, okay, we can follow up.
I think we have time for more 3 questions, quick questions.
And quick answers.
There in the back.
Thank you. Well, I'm Pedro from State University of Rio de Janeiro, and I would like to pose a question about that graph that mixed the Gini index before the fiscal policy and after, and it's quite an intriguing, and as Angela said, we couldn't check all the info related to the graph, but it offered a general perception that state more or less has a redistributive role in capitalist societies. And I was wondering if the monetary policy, meaning the payment of interest for public debt, and the extractive role, I mean, the charging of taxes, are included in the calculus, because I don't know if it will maintain the picture of state always having a more or less redistributive role in capitalist societies. So there's a question, because it was only a reference to fiscal policy. But I'd like to thank for the presentation, and I'd like to, well, I'll pose a second question, but it's enough, this one.
No? That's it? Okay.
Do you like to comment on Juan Pablo's article, this primary distributions could be also?
No, necessarily, no. But
you see, I'm trying to find some support.
But if you want, I can answer that. I can.
Go ahead.
At times, states may act redistributing in the wrong direction. There are many state policies that act to confirm, to increase inequalities. The fiscal policies can go one way and they can go another way too. So in a sense, there is no necessary redistributive role of the state. We expect in democracies that are also capitalist societies, that the state will be progressive, will do progressive redistribution. What we see in Latin America, and I remember the information, the papers by Juan Pablo Jimenez, who did the whole study of the fiscal policies in Latin America, and the states do not redistribute in a progressive way. The state confirms, strengthens issues of inequality. And those issues of inequality are created by forms of production, by capitalist, by transactions in markets, in labor markets, and so on. So it's a relationship between labor and capital. And so you have the idea that you may have a kind of primary distribution, that is how much of what is produced goes to capital and how much goes to labor. That's the first thing. And once this is set, and this is part of social struggles, and I come from a country, Argentina, where the distribution of the primary distribution, that is how much goes to capital and how much goes to labor, has changed over 50 years, like plop, 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 because it depends on political struggles and it depends on political regimes. This is part of, and the strength of the labor movement and so on and so forth. But then, once you have that, then you have the role of the state as a second. The state has a role in primary distribution too, because it's based on agreements that are sanctioned by the state. But then you have this secondary distribution or redistribution, and that is state policies, which may go in different directions. And one thinks that, for instance, public schools is a way of progressive redistribution, and it's not necessarily so, because it depends what level, if is it primary, secondary. I think things have changed, but when I was a student, we always had the example of Brazil that had a university system that was free, a primary school that was free and state, but it had a secondary school that was mostly private. So at the end, it was a redistribution towards middle classes who could send their kids to private high schools and then go to public universities. So it depends, you have to look at the policies as specific, and it's not only fiscal, it's also expenditures by the state, and how does the pattern of expenditures work. So in that, that's what I could say regarding your question.
Just to add the one point in the same direction, because normally in discussions on redistribution and the role of state, scholars and also public opinion is more interested in how states spend money, so invest money. And especially in Latin America, there is very few attention, focus on how states collects money, get their revenues. And you know, this of course, tax policies are for redistribution, could be more important than social policies. And social policies, and this is what this graph on income doesn't show, is, of course, what Elizabeth Jelin was just saying. So the role of state in promoting more equality in the long run. So through public schools, through public transportation, through also medical assistance, and so on and so on. So constructing welfare institutions, what was not the case of Latin American states in recent times. So Bolsa Familias, of course, it's not really, it's not a form of welfare state. It's a social program. So, and in order to mitigate persistent inequalities, we have, of course, to construct more welfare. Otherwise, but this is perhaps the topic for the next round, in the round table. And concerning interest, I will redirect the question to Lena Lavinas, because she's the expert for the topic, and she will also talk about financiarization in the round table, and your question will be addressed there, I'm sure. Isn't it, Lena?
So thank you again for this very inspiring conversation. You'll certainly continue in the coffee break, and we'll reconvene at 4:30 for the continuation of this discussion.